Tonight, higher taxes at the top end and thousands of public service jobs to go as the state government moves to pay down its huge debt. Also tonight, Tigerland in shock after three-time premiership coach Damien Hardwick calls it quits. The Albanese government flags federal police involvement in the PwC tax scandal. And Modi mania hits Australia with thousands gathering to see the Indian Prime Minister. Good evening. Tamara O'Dine with ABC News. Big business, holiday homeowners and landlords will bear the brunt of the state government's debt repayment plan set out in a high-taxing state budget today. Treasurer Tim Pallas has honoured election commitments in his 9th budget, with billions awarded to health and education. But the savings have to come from somewhere, so under a 10-year COVID repayment plan, up to 4,000 bureaucrats will face the sack. It's not good news either for Victorians who own a second home or investment property. Under a new COVID debt levy, they'll be slugged with higher land taxes, and there'll be a payroll tax rise for big business too. State political reporter Richard Willingham begins our coverage.
It's a budget that targets the top end of town. Tim Pallas delivering an unforgiving solution to Victoria's debt crisis.
Our plan is temporary, targeted and above all responsible.
That plan hits big business with a national payroll of more than $10 million with an extra 0.5% levy on wages. It'll be an extra 0.5% again for those with a salary bill above $100 million. The policy will raise nearly $4 billion in 4 years.
We know some did better out of the pandemic than others, and it's only fair that those that did well contribute to the repayment effort.
And that will unfortunately result in job losses.
But it's Victorian property owners that will be slugged the most as part of a COVID debt repayment scheme. In particular, landlords, businesses and people with holiday homes will pay on average an extra $1,300 each year in land tax.
This is a tax on renters.
380,000 properties will pay land tax for the first time, including apartment owners. It's caused panic about rental affordability.
Under no circumstances should that be passed on to tenants.
It was a horror move, and there's nothing in this budget, unfortunately, to increase supply.
Foreign investors who don't live in their Victorian properties will pay more under a vacancy tax, raising more than $1 billion.
The COVID debt levy will raise $8.6 billion in COVID debt offsets over 4 years. It will end in 2033.
4,000 public servants will also be sacked.
We haven't seen cuts of this magnitude since the Baillieu government. Services will collapse, and the government has learnt nothing.
But the state's wages bill for the public sector continues to grow due to the recruitment of more frontline workers. The government assumes unemployment will increase in the coming years, while it believes there will be a significant drop in inflation. Despite the COVID repayment plan, Victoria's net debt continues to rise, climbing to $171.4 billion in June 2027. That's nearly a quarter of the state's economy. And the state's still running at a $4 billion deficit. It won't be back in black for 2 years.
Budget of mean contradictions. Higher taxes, higher debt, less investment, less jobs.
Like households, the state has been whacked by interest rate rises. Interest repayments for the next financial year are already going to cost taxpayers $15 million a day. Richard Willingham, ABC News, Melbourne.
Despite the bad news for some, the government's keen to show it's getting on with the job of growing the economy. Small businesses are winners in this budget, with the government vowing to lift the tax-free threshold for payroll tax from $700,000 to $900,000 from next year. Stamp duty on commercial properties will be phased out, replaced by an annual property tax that can be paid over 10 years. And a levy on business insurance has been scrapped. But the tax breaks don't extend to elite private schools. About 110 of the most expensive will no longer be exempt from payroll tax. The broader education sector will benefit from significant spending in the coming year, including $618 million to build 9 new schools in Melbourne, upgrades at another 43 schools and $1.4 billion to continue the government's free kindergarten scheme. The budget also tips $4.9 billion into the strained health system, including $320 million for new hospital infrastructure, increasing statewide hospital capacity by more than 300 patients, and $286 million for women's health. That includes funding for 20 new dedicated health clinics. The Treasurer says today's budget was his most difficult yet. The opposition's described it as nasty. For his part, the Premier Daniel Andrews says despite the spending cuts and the new taxes, today's budget was all about delivering a positive plan for the things that matter. He spoke with Richard Willingham.
Premier, this budget imposes a new land tax on 380,000 properties for the first time. What's to stop them passing that on to potential renters?
Well, there's a couple of issues. First of all, we've got to get that COVID credit card, those emergency borrowings, we've got to get that balance back down to zero. On average, property prices have gone up, property value has gone up by nearly 90% over the last 10 years. So we think there is a capacity to pay. Rental prices are, I think, much more a function of not enough rental supply rather than a relatively modest additional land tax.
But there's nothing to stop landlords passing this on to renters.
Of course, we have made nearly 100 changes to the Residential Tenancies Act. None of you could only increase the rent once a year. So that's the first point to make. That was not the case previously. You can sign long-term leases, you can have a pet and hang a picture on the wall. We've made enormous changes to that whole framework, and we're not ruling out making further announcements in terms of protecting renters, but also adding rental supply. That's the big driver. It's not land tax that's driven rents up 25% in the last 12 months. It's the lack of rental units, the lack of supply. That's what's driving this. And we're going to have a lot more to say about that in just a few months.
This budget has put more levies on big business. You've already done that with mental health and other payments. What's stopping them from taking off and setting up interstate or overseas because of the increased impost on them?
Well, there are many reasons to be headquartered in Melbourne, whether it be the quality of our people, the quality of skills.
But if the cost of business is too much, why would they do it?
What I'd say to you is that's a matter for individual businesses, but at the moment people can't find staff. They're not struggling to find customers. The mental health levy did not see them have less people working in Victoria. This is going to be very soon the biggest city in our nation. For many, businesses are doing very well, and a contribution to that COVID debt repayment plan, that COVID credit card, is exactly the right thing to do. Our kids will, I think, forever remember COVID, Rich, but I won't make them pay for it. We have to put this 10-year plan down, and that's exactly what we've delivered.
Well, in Melbourne's growing outer suburbs, the response to the budget has been mixed. Money for road upgrades is welcome, but infrastructure funding has been slashed. And as Richard mentioned just there with the Premier, tenants are worried a levy on landlords will force up rents.
Darren Blackley has been looking for a rental in Melbourne's outer north for more than 3 months. His current landlord is selling because they can't keep up with rate rises.
Very hard, because I don't want to put my family on the streets.
He's worried today's property levy for landlords will be passed on to tenants.
Doesn't matter where you're from, it's like north, south, east, west, it's like everyone is finding it tough.
Melbourne's north is one of the state's fastest growing areas. Locals are welcoming $674 million to upgrade roads and intersections. The government is slashing the Growing Suburbs Fund from $50 million to $10 million.
It has been a very, very important part of the way we deliver infrastructure in growth areas, and the significant cut, almost the decimation of the program, is going to be felt far and wide.
The government says it's focused on delivering about 150 projects currently underway. In Craigieburn, locals say infrastructure is desperately needed.
For example, from our school, there's no basketball court in walking distance. It would be good to have a swimming pool closer and just more things for young people to do.
Sometimes you miss the bus, sometimes it's full, you don't have space to go on the bus.
Others want more practical jobs training.
Because I've been running some of the hands-on training programs for almost 3-4 years now, and they're the ones that have helped my community, our women, to start their own businesses.
Jobs closer to home puts less pressure on infrastructure. Margaret Paul, ABC News, Melbourne.
Victoria's native timber industry will be shut down 6 years earlier than planned, with a further $200 million in today's budget to help workers transition to new jobs. The native timber industry was scheduled to be wrapped up by 2030, but that's been brought forward to the end of this year. The extra funds bring the total amount of government assistance to almost $900 million and will help pay for worker support services and a transition to plantation timber. Environmentalists are celebrating, but for the communities working on long-term plans to move away from logging, the announcement came as a shock.
What it's going to do to rural Victoria, all the little towns that revolve around sawmills, is just going to close those towns and give those people no security of their future.
Finally, we have had Labor being dragged, kicking and screaming, but what a result to finally be seeing the end of native forest logging in Victoria. It has been so destructive.
To the rest of the day's news now. And Damien Hardwick has coached his last game for Richmond after making the shock decision to quit the position effective immediately. The 50-year-old says he no longer has the energy to continue in the high-pressure role and that poor results this season have prompted the move. Hardwick exits the game as a modern great, having dragged the Tigers from the doldrums to a premiership dynasty.
Not one to enjoy the spotlight, Damien Hardwick sat front and centre and told a room packed with players, staff and media that his time at Tigerland was up.
From the bottom of my heart, boys, I wish you all the very best. I'm going to miss you.
Hardwick says it was a tough call, but ultimately he didn't have the energy to continue.
If I couldn't give 100%, there was no way I was going to coach this footy club.
It was a decision many didn't see coming.
Make no mistake, his decision has come as a shock.
Others could see frustration.
We were committed to working through it, but Damien said the tank's empty.
Struggling near the bottom of the ladder, Hardwick realised there would be no fairy tale finish. But he leaves the Tigers a central figure in rewriting its history, turning perennial losers into a powerhouse. After surviving 2016, he coached a drought-breaking flag in 2017 before backing it up in 2019 and 20. The Tigers' longest-serving coach with 3 premierships under his belt, Damien Hardwick clearly leaves behind an incredible legacy of success on the field. But it's the moments off the field that Hardwick says he'll miss the most. 3-time premiership coach Mick Malthouse believes Hardwick will coach again.
Down the track at the end of this year, the bug will be still there in his system and he'll need to scratch it.
Hardwick says right now just needs a break.
Speaking to some of the players, and Dustin suggested I go to Ibiza, and Bates suggested I go to Lake. It's somewhere in between where I'll find myself.
One final celebration for one of the greatest coaches in the modern era. Tom Maddox, ABC News, Melbourne.
Thousands of supporters from the Indian community have converged on Sydney to catch a glimpse of India's Prime Minister. Narendra Modi is here for meetings with our Minister and business leaders, but he's a polarising figure with critics angry that he's here.
Sydney rolled out the red carpet for the leader of the world's largest democracy. What was meant to be a meeting of Quad leaders instead is a duo of Prime Ministers. Inside, it had the buzz of a rock concert with a sellout crowd of more than 20,000 supporters.
Namaste, Australia!
Some diehards were able to get up close to Narendra Modi as he checked in to his Sydney hotel. Others travelled across the country for the extravaganza. There was even a specially chartered flight from Melbourne dubbed Modi Airways.
We all are welcoming Modi today. Har Har Modi. We are very excited to see him. Of course, we are an Indian Australian, but still, we love him.
Spirits have been high all day, with a visual feast of Indian culture keeping crowds entertained.
A visit by the Indian Prime Minister is rare. It's been almost a decade since Narendra Modi was last here in Australia, so organisers have made sure to pull out all the stops for today's reception.
It's really a very proud moment for us that he has come to Sydney.
Mr Modi spent the day meeting Australian business leaders, scientists and even a pop star.
It was a very broad-ranging discussion from building the economy of India, close collaboration with Australia.
But not everyone has been as welcoming, with protesters accusing the Indian Prime Minister of committing human rights abuses.
After his election,
We have seen a rise in crimes against minorities.
A polarising figure, but one who can count on the fervent support of his fans at home and abroad. Lydia Feng, ABC News, Sydney.
The packed event at Sydney Stadium has just gotten underway and there's been some tension with protesters outside. Foreign Affairs reporter Stephen Jedgetts is there.
Well, there's been a brief outbreak of anger and tension here at Sydney's Olympic Park. Dozens of protesters who are supporters of the Khalistan movement pushing for an independent state for Sikhs in northern India have been waving flags outside the stadium and saying Mr Modi is not welcome in Australia because of human rights abuses back in India. A small group of Mr Modi's supporters noticed them and moved out to the fences, yelling slogans against Khalistan and angrily denouncing the protesters. But police moved in quickly to keep the two groups apart and defuse the situation, ushering Mr Modi supporters back inside. And in the building, the atmosphere was far more harmonious. Mr Modi and Mr Albanese are being treated to cultural performances from members of the Indian diaspora. This is a celebration of the growing Indian-Australian population, and it's sure, at least this demonstration is sure, to win approval from Mr Modi.
Coming up on 7:30 with Sarah Ferguson, as rental prices soar, Australia's housing dream becomes a renter's nightmare.
I'm currently paying $670 a week. My rent is going to go up to $850 per week.
Essentially fallen off its hinges. It's kind of rotting through.
I own 78 properties in total and I rent out 77.
Also, one of the world's most celebrated black writers, Bernardine Evaristo, joins me tonight. That's coming up.
More details have emerged about the death of an Australian man who was climbing Mount Everest. Jason Kennison died on Friday morning while descending from the peak of the mountain. The 40-year-old was born in South Australia but had since moved to Perth. The tour company which helped Mr Kennison on his climb says he succumbed to high-altitude cerebral edema, a condition where the brain swells from lack of oxygen. The company says the challenging weather meant they couldn't retrieve his body. Pressure is building on the scandal-plagued consulting firm PwC, with a Senate grilling on government contracts expected later this week. The government says it's investigating whether criminal charges against the firm's executives could be laid.
Billions of dollars on the line, political pressure and the threat of criminal charges. The government is preparing to act.
We've got Treasury looking at an investigation into what has occurred and looking at whether criminal charges should be referred to the AFP.
The scandal broke when former PwC partner Peter Collins was barred by his profession after sharing confidential details from Treasury about a crackdown on multinational tax avoidance. Internal emails show the firm used the intelligence to help other clients get around the new laws.
Tom, what does this email tell you?
It tells us that there's been aggressive marketing going on. They've had people working several time zones. They've had people working over a tight time frame. So it tells us how frenetic the pace was in dealing with the arrangements of companies to work around the law.
Businesses subject to the same rigorous regulation as PwC are astonished.
Fairly shocked that a professional financial services company in Australia the size of PwC could be committing such blatant, unethical and potentially illegal behaviour.
And we're yet to see the confidentiality agreement between PwC and Treasury.
That really colours whether there's going to be criminal or other sorts of consequences that flow from it.
Questions remain as to whether anyone will go to jail. But the saga has thrown into doubt PwC's ability to win new contracts from its biggest client, the federal government. The firm has received more than $500 million in just the past 2 years. Daniel Ziffer, ABC News.
A police officer who tasered an elderly woman with dementia in a New South Wales nursing home has been suspended with pay. 95-year-old Claire Noland fell and fractured her skull after she was tasered by the senior constable. Police say she was carrying a serrated knife and using a walking frame. She remains in a critical condition in Cooma Base Hospital. The 33-year-old officer who fired the taser has 12 years of experience. Police have charged a 24-year-old man in the wake of a fatal car accident in Caulfield South last week. Police allege the man's BMW crashed into another vehicle on North Road just after 10:30 p.m. last Monday. Both of the people in the other car, a 31-year-old man and a 22-year-old woman, died at the scene. Last night, the BMW driver was charged with 2 counts of culpable driving after he was released from hospital. He's been bailed to appear in Melbourne Magistrates Court in September. Police are searching for a teenager who they believe can help with their investigation into a fatal stabbing in Melbourne's west. 16-year-old Pason Lahim was killed in Sunshine last Thursday after an altercation between 2 groups. Today, police released photos of 17-year-old Mayek Atem, who detectives want to speak to. He hasn't returned home since Friday. Police say his family is helping and detectives are appealing for anyone who knows where he is to come forward.
He's a 17-year-old male. He will be floating around out there and people will know where he is.
Queensland researchers hope a universal, long-lasting flu vaccine could end the need for annual flu jabs. A phase 2 trial is underway for a vaccine that would potentially last for several years. Unlike current flu shots, it would target parts of the virus that don't mutate. This year, there have already been more than 40,000 confirmed cases of influenza and 44 deaths in Australia. With low uptakes of people getting the jab, researchers hope it will also address vaccine fatigue. It'll be at least 2 more years before the vaccine is widely available.
If we could have a new vaccine that didn't quite need to be topped up as often and also prepared us for a new and emerging pandemic flu strain, which may well happen in a year, then that's obviously going to be a big change to how we handle influenza.
Thailand's Progressive Move Forward Party has signed a coalition agreement with 7 other parties, laying out an ambitious agenda for reform after 9 years of military rule. The agreement lists a wide range of agreed issues, but 2 policies are already stoking debate.
Cannabis sellers have sprouted up right across Thailand since the plant was decriminalised last year. Now they're wondering what the future holds, with plans by the new Move Forward coalition to reclassify marijuana as a controlled substance.
If it's illegal imports, if you open the shops without any permit, then we have a strong legal mandate to be able to control.
But there are 9,000 legally registered sellers.
By putting it back into narcotics, it's removing it out of our reach so that we can't actually control it. And I don't want to see that happen.
Thailand's Progressive Move Forward Party has been riding high since winning the most votes in last week's election. But it's had to form an 8-party coalition to govern, and that's meant making compromises. Cannabis is only one of them. The coalition signed a 23-point policy agreement, and one of Move Forward's key election promises has been left out, a pledge to review the controversial law that cracks down on criticism of the royal family.
It's clear that the other coalition partners, virtually all of them are against it.
Supporters say the party's sold out.
Right from the start, they've lost their identity, their direction and their principles. They'll pay a high price.
The leader says he will put the royal defamation law before the parliament once he gets there.
Mr Peter is calling himself Prime Minister-elect, but he still needs to win the support of the military-controlled Senate to be chosen as PM. And in a country that's just emerged from 9 years of military rule, this will be a challenge. Mazoe Ford, ABC News, Bangkok.
Portuguese police have resumed searching for Madeleine McCann, who went missing during a family holiday in the country's south 16 years ago. Police have set up tents next to a dam 50 kilometres from where the then 3-year-old was last seen in 2007. The renewed search is taking place at the request of German authorities, who last year named one of their citizens as the main suspect in the case. They say Christian Bruckner, who's currently in prison for rape, was in the area around the time Madeleine disappeared. The writer who won a $7 million sexual abuse and defamation case against Donald Trump is pursuing further legal action against him. E. Jean Carroll is seeking at least $15 million in additional damages over remarks made by the former president a day after the verdict. 2 weeks ago, a New York jury found Donald Trump had sexually abused Ms. Carroll in the mid-90s and then defamed her. Her lawyers are now claiming that he doubled down on derogatory remarks about Ms. Carroll during a CNN town hall appearance. To Finance Now, here's David Chow.
It was another quiet day for the share market, with even more incremental developments in the US debt ceiling saga. Qantas, on the other hand, was not so quiet. The airline trumpeted its expectations of a record profit, up to $2.5 billion this financial year, which would be even higher than its previous record of $1.6 billion. Although Qantas says airfares are coming down, they're still much higher compared to pre-COVID days. And that's why its revenue is much higher compared to the number of tickets it's selling on domestic and international flights. Our insatiable demand for travel is boosting Qantas's margins. And the $2 billion worth of taxpayer subsidies it got during the pandemic wouldn't have hurt either. Despite that, Qantas's share price fell quite sharply today, but Zipco managed to claw back all its losses from yesterday, and its share price surged to its highest level in over 3 months. In the end, the All Ords went down by a tiny fraction, practically flat, while Asian markets didn't do so well today, and Wall Street's key index, the S&P 500, ended its day flat. Interestingly, the S&P has jumped by 9% since the year began, but this was driven by just a handful of companies like Facebook and Microsoft, who are dabbling in the next big thing, artificial intelligence. Without these tech giants, Wall Street would actually be down for the year. Meanwhile, the Aussie dollar is steady at 66.5 US cents, while oil prices recovered and gold prices are a little bit weaker. And that's finance.
One of the most successful sprint cyclists in history, Mark Cavendish, will retire at the end of the season. The 38-year-old British rider will be attempting to break the long-standing record for the most stage wins at the Tour de France this year, having equalled Eddie Merckx's mark of 34 in 2021. He announced his retirement plans during a rest day on the Giro d'Italia. Now with the weather, here's Paul Higgins.
And Sam, we're in for a bit of a mixed bag of weather over the next little while. Dry tomorrow in Melbourne, but it will be wet and windy on Thursday. It was the coldest morning of the year at Echuca, Hopeton, Kyabram, Mildura, Shepparton and Swan Hill. Minus temperatures in all those places, or negative temperatures, I suppose is better English, isn't it? There was some high cloud today in the west, partly cloudy across central and eastern parts. Mallacoota, Mildura and Orbost all reached 18 degrees, but Bairnsdale in Victoria's Riviera went one better with 19. We actually ended up with more sunshine than was forecast today in Melbourne, enough to push the city high to 16.8 at 2:20 this afternoon. Outside now it is back to 12 degrees. Perth had some showers late today, thunderstorms nearby as well, down as low as -8 at Cooma, New South Wales this morning. That's because a large high is sitting over the east, so they've got clear skies there and light winds. There's a trough and cold front over the nation's southwest. That front is going to race across the Bight tomorrow to be in Victoria on Thursday. It'll become windy here tomorrow as that front gets closer and those isobars squash up there. And then on Thursday, a band of rain will cross the state, around 5 to 10 millimetres of it, and there'll be a blast of colder air as well. Tomorrow, sunny in Sydney and Brisbane, and in Canberra and Adelaide, mostly sunny. Perth will have some morning showers. Hobart should be partly cloudy. Back home, another night of single-digit lows, although it stays in positive figures out of the mountains. Some very isolated showers near the coast and ranges, and some patchy morning fog expected in the northeast. There is a frost warning for the Mallee, Northern Country, northeast and east Gippsland, and a warning of sheep graziers in the north central, northeast and central districts, plus Gippsland. A northerly wind on the bay, 15 to 30 knots, so strong winds on Port Phillip, along with the west and the central coasts. Down to 9 degrees in Melbourne tonight, getting up to 17 tomorrow. That's the same as today, but it'll feel quite a bit cooler out in the fresh northerly wind. It'll be a partly cloudy day. Windy on Thursday, and it will be cloudy with rain mostly from mid to late morning and a colder westerly wind in the afternoon, getting up to 17 before that arrives. Friday, cloudy with a shower or two, especially in our southeast, and just 14. Saturday, cloudy with a possible shower, a northwesterly wind, and 16. Showers on Sunday, it'll be cloudy with a north-northwest wind, 15. Still a shower or two on Monday and a cloudy Tuesday, Tam.
Thank you, Paul. That's it for this evening's bulletin. Sarah Ferguson is up next.